We're tired of the USA waving its finger around instead of actually helping nations that need it, and then putting up with this when prosperous economic possibilities are right next door. So what do we stand for as proposition in this debate? We believe that ASEAN should join all the Chinese-based economic communities such as the BRI and the AIIB, therefore facilitating more integrated trade. Note that we would not be abandoning the West entirely, but prioritizing China. This could look like prioritizing securing working visas with China and not the West, and ASEAN national banks cooperating more with AIIB than with the IMF. And we'd still be able to send ships to, for example, California and Alaska, but we would prioritize the trade nodes that go through Shenzhen and Beijing. What the opposition has to prove today is how they would get more investment from the West than we get from China. They need to engage in the comparative. 3 arguments coming from Team Proposition today. First of all, how closer ties with China will benefit the most vulnerable actor. Second of all, why it actively harms ASEAN if it aligns itself closer with the West. And coming from my second speaker, third of all, why ASEAN benefits in the long term. Moving on to my first argument about how closer ties with China will benefit the most vulnerable actors. So China has been keen on cooperating with ASEAN for years now. It makes no sense to not profit from such a logical economic possibility. So the question is, why partnering with China will benefit the individuals from the poorest socioeconomic backgrounds? 4 points under this. First of all, and this is just common sense, most of the ASEAN neighboring countries are neighboring to China or otherwise very close to it, making trade a lot cheaper between the two countries. I mean, just imagine sending a shipment from Port Klang in Malaysia to the port of Shanghai in China. Sure, you'd need a ferry in a few days. And now imagine sending that same shipment from Malaysia to the port of Los Angeles. Suddenly you need a cargo ship, and now you need to cross the Pacific Ocean. It is illogical to spend money, time, and resources on less efficient trade. Second of all, China has a booming middle class, meaning it has purchasing power and it can buy what ASEAN has to sell, and it also needs materials for production, materials that ASEAN can provide. Third of all, China has a demographic problem and it needs workers. This is because China has an aging population and because education is increasing in China while the need for unskilled labor stays the same. And don't let the opposition, and we're not going to let the opposition come up here today and tell us that China is actually going to harm the ASEAN member states by chasing some sort of geopolitical goals. China will not be harmful to ASEAN for 2 main reasons. First of all, it doesn't have the incentive. China is fully aware of the growing skepticism it receives from the rest of the world. Plus, China, even if China wanted to be some sort of political superpower, it wouldn't be able to do that by making enemies out of everyone. And second of all, it isn't possible, no thank you, because ASEAN is a collective entity and not just one single unprotected country. So don't let the opposition fool you with examples of one single country being done harm by China doing harm to one single country. Those examples are irrelevant. Further of all, China has an interest in the ASEAN middle class because this will be a consumer class. So interest comes from both sides, both countries today. Why is this important? 2 reasons. First of all, China would be importing labor, greatly helping the working class of, for example, Laos, Vietnam, and the Philippines find jobs. I mean, 8 million Filipinos are expected to lose their job by the end of 2021 due to the COVID crisis, adding to the 7 million Filipinos that are, no thank you, already unemployed. These are in total like 5 Estonias of people that we could ensure jobs for. Second of all, we get more foreign direct investment because, I mean, the AIIB is known for being more giving than the IMF. Furthermore, what we get is actually better for 2 reasons. First of all, China actually invests in infrastructure, unlike Western multinationals. And second of all, multinationals, speaking of, do not equal long-term growth. All they really do is meddle in politics, shaping it to its liking, and suck out the natural resources, ruining the environment of these countries. This is not going to help the developing economies of ASEAN. Moving on to my second argument, before I move on to my second argument, I'll take that POI.
Do you think Chinese genocide and other human rights violations are ever justified?
No, of course not. And China has proven to have these bad goals in the future. But what we're saying is that the ASEAN countries, because of the specific situation, actually benefit because of this. And I'll prove this, and I'll prove how China actually is better of a trade partner than the West in my argument now about why it actively harms ASEAN if it aligns itself closer with the West. So China has proven to be a profitable and more logical trade partner, and it makes no sense to antagonize it, especially for nations in which we want to see a peaceful period of economic growth. So the question is, why aligning with the West would provoke China? 4 points under this. First of all, China has already won the disputes in the South China Sea. They have soldiers there, they have boots on the ground, and despite the United Nations ruling, that territory is theirs. Now, if ASEAN were to align with the West, it would lose access and benefits of trade through the South China Sea, trade that thousands of lives and jobs depend on. But if ASEAN started working with China, no thank you, it would have more access because these countries would generally be a lot friendlier. Second of all, the United States and China are not on the best terms already. I mean, the United States has military presence in Japan, South Korea, plus a de facto embassy in Taiwan, and these countries have proven to not fear slashing tariffs onto each other. We've already seen this quite recently with Trump's tariffs. Tariffs mean great losses on both sides, and it is something that we want to avoid. And third of all, if China sees the West setting up shop in its backyard, it's way more likely to retaliate with restrictions on trade with ASEAN, which is exactly what the opposition should be trying to deter.
Point.
And fourth of all, it is no thank you, generally very, very threatening to get on China's bad side. I mean, China has already threatened war on the Philippines and Taiwan over the South China Sea, and it's allowed the military to fire on the fishing vessels of its competitions. China has proven to not taking well to enemies. Now, if the ASEAN countries were to align with the West, they'd have to invest in defense. This is something that these countries cannot afford. So what we generally see is a grand influx of benefits of aligning with China and meaningful consequences of trading with the West. But why is this important? Two reasons. No, thank you. First of all, we get the most vulnerable affected. By increasing tariffs and restrictions, we get more expensive imports. These are household items that these people would now not be able to afford. Plus, we generally get more lost job opportunities. By restricting the movement of labor, the people who need jobs, the people who want to feed their families, feed themselves, are not able to get these jobs with in cooperation with China. And second of all, we get a generally much more volatile military situation. I mean, China is now pushed into a corner without economic partnerships, and it is way more likely to lash out, showcasing strength to its neighboring countries, ding, 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 ASEAN, and showcasing its strength in the South China Sea, which we've already explained is terrible for the fishermen, for the workers, for the families of those workers, and this is going to impact thousands, if not millions, of people. So ladies and gentlemen, when millions of lives and the welfare of whole countries is in question, we on Side Proposition would rather cooperate with China, choosing reason and reality, than align with the West, choosing principles and empty promises. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that speech. First speaker of all, here.
So, China, dear panel, China is a country that sacrifices human lives in order to maximize their economic growth. This is the reason why we cannot have a powerful China. We have two arguments in this debate: dependence on China in our first speech and replacing China in our second speech. But before I move on to my arguments, I will make some rebuttals. Firstly, this motion says that this house believes that ASEAN, not this house as ASEAN. Therefore, we don't have to debate only about ASEAN. Secondly, they said that China has booming middle class, but actually we can see that the West also already has these consumers who are ready to buy these products with higher price than China, because China produces their own products. So in our world, ASEAN can make more profit than with only trade with China. Also, ASEAN has, they said that ASEAN has more investments when they cope with China, but we see that actually China is doing investments only to get something done, not actually to help these people. For example, they did in Africa highways to nowhere, but only to get that attention and to get the mark that you have done something, not actually to help someone. Also, ASEAN is already now trading more with the West, about 30% with the US and EU combined, but right now there is only 15% with China. This situation has not led to more harm coming to ASEAN. There were under as
POI.
won't happen either. Now I will move on to my argument. Dependence on China. In this argument will prove to you that ASEAN countries will become dangerously dependent on China. Two reasons why China wants to make countries dependent. Firstly, China wants long-term power. It is easier to achieve it when partners are controlled by it as much as possible. In that case, they won't seek out other trade partners or damage China's interests. Hence, wants to make countries dependent on itself through any means necessary. For example, willing to kill people, create instability, and trick countries in order to gain it. Secondly, China is not democratic. Leaders don't have to answer to the people. This means China is willing to suffer economic harm to make the countries dependent. Three ways countries become dependent. Firstly, China pursues debt trap diplomacy. By building infrastructure in partner countries, gives out
POI.
loans knowing that the recipient country most likely cannot pay them back. When the recipient country inevitably defaults on the loan, China takes control of the infrastructure project they built that are usually with strategic significance, such as the port in Sri Lanka or railways in Zimbabwe. This means ASEAN countries will now become very directly impacted by Chinese economic decisions. If China wants to close the port or railway, the country is helpless. Secondly, trade with China,
POI.
trade relations with other countries. Given that China's market is enormous, it can do trade in large enough amounts to effectively block out all other trade partners. ASEAN will most likely do most of their trade with China and become dependent on Chinese import and export. This means ASEAN will have to stay in China's good grace in order to keep the economy going. And thirdly, China undermines political systems. China will be incentivized to assert more control over countries' information,
POI.
make them less likely to seek out other partners and to get better trade deals. They buy huge stakes in media companies and influence public opinion and fund pro-China politicians. This makes pro-China sentiment artificially high and undermines the local governments. Two reasons why ASEAN will fall in the trap. Firstly, there is more ASEAN-wide trust in China. China's motivation seems clearer. Strong trade partners are useful, so China's investments in infrastructure and other projects make sense. ASEAN countries aren't working on moving to the West. There is no ASEAN-wide strategic reason not to accept the help. And secondly, note here panel that China is blatantly telling countries it will take control and it won't happen instantly. But it's all very subtle and done carefully, so it's difficult for victim countries to stop them as they might not realize what's happening. Poorer countries with less know-how, like Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, are more likely to accept Chinese offers as they likely don't see the traps. This dependence has two harms, economic and political. ASEAN countries will now have less power over their own economic decisions and thus are more likely to make decisions that are harmful for them in the long term while keeping the short-term relationship with China. For example, ASEAN will fear to cooperate with third countries as it might upset China. This means they lose out on beneficial trade deals and their people will stay in poverty. Secondly, political. Political leaders are less likely to care for the people as they are essentially appointed by China. This means there will be almost 700 million people who now will not have responsible politicians representing them under prop. But why do we prefer the West? The West promotes a sustainable growth and human rights. Note here, panel, that by human rights we don't mean abolishing the pay gap, but rather the freedom not to get killed while going to the store just because someone is a Muslim, for instance. Secondly, we concede that the West isn't always perfect, but is better than China, who actively commits genocide and funds terrorists. For all those reasons, we cannot have a powerful China. Vote opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Second speaker from Prop here.
So I hope you can all hear me well. I also prefer POIs audibly. That's okay with the other team. Okay. $30 billion United States dollars. That's how much money China has invested in ASEAN countries during the last 2 years. We regret the vagueness on opposition in this motion, where they say, oh, but at least we get like democracy from the West. They showed us no mechanism of how they're going to institute this in ASEAN countries or change this in China. Therefore, we believe that this debate is ultimately boils down to the two most important questions. First and most important, which side helps the most vulnerable economic actors in this debate? And secondly, which side wins on like the geopolitical question, right? Now, but after that, I will provide the third substantive argument from proposition, why for ASEAN, it is better to choose China for long-term growth. Now, let's dive into the first question in this debate about which side helps the most vulnerable. When we came up, we already told you that China has a demographic problem, so they will need labor. This means that currently there are millions of people like living in ASEAN countries who would like to escape poverty, because the comparative at the moment under the West's leadership or whatever is living on subsistence agriculture, right? Where the harvest depends on like climate circumstances, right? And whether or not you're going to be able to put the food on your family's table depends on that harvest, right? We would rather see these people like having eased travel restrictions to China and filling in those gaps in labor. No response to such analysis, which we believe is one of the most significant points in this debate. But secondly, we told you that China simply has like proximity in this debate. Also, no analysis on this one. Like from every single trade route, from every single ship container, we're able to save money for the ASEAN countries, money which they can reinvest in like medicine or education in their own countries. Thirdly, we already said we want to characterize that in this debate, like the growth of China's middle class is different from the middle class of the US, because US already has a middle class, right? They're far less likely to import goods from ASEAN countries, whereas China like has this expanding demand. Therefore, the propensity to like consume products that are not as advanced that are produced to like in ASEAN countries is far greater. They're a far more profitable market for these countries. Fourthly, we say that the foreign, like they wanted to talk about like the foreign direct investment that China does, like having highways to literally nowhere. Like that may be true in Africa, but it is not entirely like it's entirely not true in this particular debate. Why? Because China needs these trade routes because they want to like circumvent like the Strait of Malacca, which is currently which they're currently unsure about if they can control, right? They want these infrastructure projects to help them move things around. As a side benefit, it means that ASEAN will be able to move things around more efficiently and faster as well. Like China, like the roads that are left from like the ports or the bridges that are built stay on ASEAN's side of the house. Compare that to the West, right? The West come in with like multinational corporations, which then stuck all the profits in their own pockets and transferred them back to the Western countries like in EU or the United States. Essentially, ASEAN is left with nothing tangible in the long term in forms of infrastructure on their side of the house. So we don't really see how that fits. Before I move on, yes, I'll take that.
Yeah, but like, what is the impact of having that infrastructure when China one day just says, well, actually, we don't like this anymore. We're going to get rid of this because we paid for it with our money and we got the control over it that you defaulted on the loan.
You're not going to blow up every single dam like built on the river that like generates electricity, every single road, every single bridge. That's like just a silly characterization coming from E for Estonia. Now, then they talked about like these liquidity traps. We congratulate Team Opposition in having read the special briefing on The Economist about the Belt and Road Initiative, but they do not understand that this is a different situation than like the impoverished countries in Africa that fall into these loans. Why? Because ASEAN is a collective entity. That's like the first response that we have, right? They have some more bargaining power because they already are sort of wary of China in the first place, right? But secondly, the authoritarian leaders that could like make up the majority of the leadership in these ASEAN countries are actually very careful like about their sovereignty, right? They're not willing to give their like authoritarian power away if they if they enter like a shady economic deal. Therefore, the characterization is completely different on the, our side of the house. Now, the second question is about geopolitics, right? We told you that it is far better if we do not provoke China. Why? Because China has already won the war on the South China Sea. This was also not engaged with at all, even though this was a significant argument in our first speaker's speech, right? We're far more likely to like trade through the South China Sea and like move our containers or access our natural resources, which currently cannot be accessed by Philippines and Vietnam in like the form of oil, because Chinese like military ships don't allow them to come near them, right? That is because China is not really sure whether or not these countries are ready to trade with them, whether or not they are friendly or not. If we show that we are friendly towards China, we might get more concessions from China on our side of the house rather than from theirs, right? Now, and lastly, at the end of this question, we recognize that like opposition wanted to talk about democracy. Democracy does not improve on either side of the house by their analysis, right? The Chinese Communist Party is not going to institute democracy in like in their own country or like in ASEAN. We don't see like any mechanism how that changes. However, even if we like disregard all of that, it is far more likely that like because we will become more economically prosperous because we help the most vulnerable, we will have like a growing middle class in ASEAN countries, which might in the long term, demand economic change. However, this debate again is not about democracy. This is about uplifting the most vulnerable actors economically in this debate, and we do that on our side of the house. Sorry, I will not take it to you. Now, the third argument on our side of the house is why ASEAN benefits in the long term. We need ASEAN to benefit in the long term through a period of stability. Why we have a longer period of stability on our side of the house? 3 reasons. First, the United States, which is the main actor from the West in this region, is simply too volatile because they have internal domestic problems, because they do not prioritize investing in ASEAN in their foreign affairs. This is simply too volatile. Compare that to China, where Xi Jinping basically stays in power until he dies. The second thing is about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the alternative economic financial structures that exist in China's side. The IMF and the World Trade Organization are European-centric or Western-centric. They put in austerity measures, as they have already done in 2008 and in the 1990s, where basically millions of people fell back into poverty because they were not generous enough in the loans. Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is more generous because they want to see Asia as the main trading place in the whole world, whereas West want to preserve their hegemony. Ladies and gentlemen, do not get blinded by the rhetoric about democracy in this debate, because this debate is about uplifting the poorest individuals. We're incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. Second speaker from up here.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Very well. I prefer my POIs by voice as well, if you can manage that. So I hope you can. Right. And I will start my speech if everyone is ready in 3, 2, 1. Dear panel, we think this debate is about the entire world, about China's influence in the entire world, how China is actively committing a genocide, how China is taking Duterte, putting him in power and letting him kill Filipinos who are his own subjects without them having any power to do anything against him, and doing the same thing over and over again all over the world without the West having currently any power over that. This debate is not only about Asian. There are other people who suffer because of this debate or because of China as well. More about this in my argument. In my speech, I have 3 points. Firstly, about money. Secondly, about dependence on China and how this will change, which also will be my argument. And thirdly, about worldwide harms we get from China right now. Let's talk about money and how Asian can get more money. We think that Asian can kind of choose which side it gets money from, right? We think that China and the US or the Western peninsula want to buy from them. They do produce things that are cheaper and in greater commodities, right? So we do think that Asian can choose in this situation and can get money from both ways. But we think that it's better for them right now to choose the West, because West is multiple countries, right? You have Australia, you have essentially Western allies like South Korea and Japan as well. You have the EU, which is 27 countries now, right? Which is then we have the US, etc. Which means that all these countries have different things they might want to buy, whereas China will probably have very specific things that they cannot produce by themselves, given that they're a very big nation. They'll probably want, and their main problem right now is that they're losing cheap labor. This is probably what they want mostly from them, cheap labor. Why is this extremely harmful? We think that China doesn't really care about human rights, right? We see that China is constantly doing very harmful things. Therefore, we don't think it's very likely that China will want to improve the situation in these poorer regions that are outside of its country, right? If you take a country like Cambodia, say, who currently has wait a little, that currently has quite a lot of people who are quite poor, they can very easily produce quite cheaply in that country. This means that it's very likely that China will want to keep that country poor, as they would get cheap labor, and that cheap labor won't be going anywhere, right? So they will maybe not strategically just not invest in that country. Therefore, the poor do not get money, whereas under our side, it's more likely since countries, firstly, have different interests, but secondly, also we think that the West kind of does abide by human rights, right? This isn't a human right democracy. This is more like, will the government try to shoot me or something like that? So we think that since the West has always been more about human rights, the people in democratic countries value human rights more, they're more likely to vote for people who aren't actually trying to make other people suffer. This is why we see that H&M is getting a lot of backlash, right? If this can happen to H&M, this can probably happen to governments. This means that these countries cannot keep certain regions of Asian poor. This is why we win the money argument. I will take the POI.
Given that all the harms you talk about when mentioning China happen currently when the West is the main trading partner, as you already outlined in your speech, is it more or less like why the West hasn't changed anything about it?
Right, I get this point. This is my second point in this speech. Let's talk about how West is currently dependent on China and how we want this to change. This is also my argument, right? We can see that the West buys a lot from China, right? If we take the US, they export 17% from China. I think the Western allies combined make up 40% of Chinese exports. This dependence is this mutual dependence is quite harmful. Firstly, it means that if China decides to not let the other people, the Western powers, have these exports, keep in mind that China is an autocracy, it can kind of decide whether or not it wants to trade, whether or not it's economically harmful. This means that the West gets hurt. Therefore, the West is kind of afraid of China hurting their economies, right? This means lost jobs. This means like unfavorable opportunities for politicians, them being criticized, etc. Therefore, politicians who want to be re-elected probably don't want to piss off China, right? But secondly, this means that the West is also afraid to anger China, right? This is because if you do something harmful for China or something that China might consider like dangerous for them, China is likely to strike back economically. We don't think that China will do much militarily against the West, given that, well, the US has a bigger army than they do, a bigger navy, and also I think that NATO is bigger collectively as well than China if we put these two together. So economic harm is the thing that matters here. So this means that it's very difficult for the West, firstly, to criticize China even, like to say that, hey, maybe you shouldn't be killing these people. And second, it's very hard also to like actually do something economically for this. But how does Asia solve this? We think that Asia produces pretty much the same things that China does. I looked up what are the main things that China produces and what are the main things that Asia produces and exports to like Western countries. First thing, electronics, electronic equipment, machinery. China does this, and Asians' first category of export is also this. Therefore, they have the expertise and can replace China on the Western market in this category. Secondly, China exports a lot of furniture. This isn't really that big of a thing in Asian countries, but we think that this is something that they can probably learn to do quite quickly. I don't think this requires a lot of skill. And thirdly, vehicles. This is also like Asians' fourth largest exports article. Therefore, they're probably aware of how to make these too. This means that even though maybe Asia produces these in smaller commodities right now, it is likely that these amounts will increase as they become more closer to the West. But why does West want to replace China on their market with Asian? We think this has two reasons. Firstly, when China is doing very harmful things right now and the world is becoming aware of this, the West realizes it doesn't really have much control over it. And this is why like politicians like Trump get a lot of support for being critical of China, and also Biden, right? This is something that politicians are interested in. And secondly, we think that being economically dependent, regardless of these like human rights issues, is something that these countries are scared of, because if you have a very, very strong neighbor, say China, or a very strong like just country like China who doesn't abide by the rules, it can hurt you very much. This is why like Western countries are interested in replacing China with Asian. What impacts does this have? Firstly, we think that Asian can get more money, therefore they can like have more voice and also help like their poor if that's what they really want to do. But secondly, and more importantly, we think that West finally gains control of China. Let's talk about Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, the president, is in power because the oligarchs put him there, right? Oligarchs care about money. If they don't have money, Xi Jinping will be removed from power. We think that Xi Jinping really wants to be in power. That's probably why he's like doing all those things when he's threatened. He doesn't like, that's obvious, right? So we think that if Xi Jinping is now in this position, that he'll either behave or he'll be removed from power, he's rather likely to behave. This means that he will be forced to stop the genocides that happen. This means that he won't rile up ethnic tensions that actually get people killed in Vietnam. That means that he doesn't fund dictatorships like the North Korean and Duterte, right? This means that people get to have more of a good life. But finally, about the worldwide harms that currently come, right? We think that China is not only operating in Asia. We think that they're also operating in South America, also in Africa, also in like other places, right? This means that the harms that happen to Asia currently are very likely also happening in these places as well. Proposition even like conceded that this means that the impacts of my argument are like worldwide. They aren't only concentrating on Asia, and we think saving more people is the beneficial thing in this debate. Therefore, we win.
Thank you for that speech. Proposition with Vaher.
Was I called? Okay, I guess
Yep.
Internet cut out for a short moment, so all I heard was here. Am I audible from here at this volume? I know I'm checking every time, just in case.
Yep, yep.
Team opposition doesn't just get to be part of some independent think tank based on the East Coast someplace, writing articles for The Economist. The West isn't the only direction that you can look from. Stand for growth. I'm going to be looking at this debate under three main clash points. Firstly, which side benefits the most vulnerable, which is the most important point. Don't let team opposition steal that with some weird kind of hazy benefits or harms to other countries. Secondly, which side isn't geopolitical suicide? And thirdly, let's talk about the long term. So firstly, on the most important point, which side benefits the most vulnerable? From the outset, we talked about the cheaper trade and how it just makes more sense to trade with China. We also characterized Chinese investment as infrastructure investment that actually builds the country, lets these people embark on entrepreneurship. And we compared this very starkly with multinationals that basically sit on top of the economy and push it down. They make people work for minimum wages. They manipulate with the government to remove labor restrictions and environmental restrictions, and basically exist to sit on top and trash that country. Moreover, because the West is so far, and under your side, you'd be lessening the possibility of people moving to China, these people have effectively lost a bargaining chip they would have had in the other case, where they could have said, oh, I'm going to go work on a railroad somewhere in China instead of working in a shoe factory for 12 hours a day. We also told you that China has the South China Sea, and they tried to talk something about the US military, which clashed with their own points. But the thing is here that China is actually the country roaming its ships around in the South China Sea, starving out the small outposts that the countries like Philippines have. They've actively said that they will fire on fishing vessels that they think encroach on their territory. They are prepping for war here. The thing is that these countries desperately need these sea areas for fishing, which so many people depend on, and also the natural resources that are underneath the sea, like oil, which could help the countries grow as well. If they join China, China is obviously going to let them in part participate in this, like they will be sharing the South China Sea. Because both China and these countries need it. And so ultimately they will gain much more. If you ostracize, if you separate both of these, there's no chance that that will happen. And it will simply all go to China. And they basically already control it. We also talked to you about demographics and how we need workers to go to China to work on these infrastructure projects, to build up a middle class in these countries, and how China needs the middle class. What Team Opposition generally brought up here is that it doesn't matter because of this broader principle. And these are people's lives. These people now depend on the seasons. They have to have rain on a certain day, otherwise their crops will fail and they will starve. These people, there are so many people in poverty, and Team Opposition basically doesn't care about these people. Also, the thing is, they talked about how West is somehow more countries and that this makes it inherently better. I've already talked about why China is inherently better. The thing is, we don't entirely cut off the West. We see that uniquely, China will cut themselves off from ASEAN and restrict all the benefits we're talking about. The West is unlikely to do this, and we're still gonna see some benefits from the West as well. Also, these fear-mongering things from them on dependence on China and the debt traps all sort of make sense. However, we have explained to you very clearly how we get on the comparative a better situation, and we are immediately able to lift these people out of poverty. We've shown how China has an incentive to not hurt the middle class of these countries and to grow the average income level of these countries. So we are willing to concede some larger geopolitical things here if it means raising these people out of poverty. You had a point.
Yes, do you agree that giving more power to China that's actively doing very, very harmful things is beneficial for anyone in the world?
China isn't actually that very harmful to these countries. The only real situation where they have tension is over the South China Sea, and we resolve that on our side. All these other examples are from Africa and other countries outside of ASEAN. I'll talk about that more in a moment. So what we bring to you in the second clash about geopolitics is that we shouldn't antagonize China because working with them would make so much more sense. China doesn't like enemies, and they will squeeze them. We see this with countries like South Korea and Australia that routinely have some sort of embargoes on various goods just designed to hurt them. If ASEAN sides with the West, China will do the same to ASEAN. And so we can get a mutually beneficial relationship on their side, and all they get is more poverty and more hunger. An example of a mutual beneficial relationship would be something like COVID now. At the beginning, China was in a bad place, and ASEAN actually helped them with whatever they had, medical equipment, emotional support, just generally not condemning them like the rest of the world. And in return, China returned that like tenfold because they wanted to strengthen this relationship between ASEAN and China. When ASEAN was in a tough situation, China gave back. And so let's talk about what the opposition had to say here. That the West pursues human rights to some degree? Well, the thing is here that most ASEAN countries at the moment are extremely authoritarian, and neither side is likely to make a humongous impact on that. But moreover, we actually build up a middle class that could be able to shift some of the power away from the government and be able to demand some sort of reform, whereas on their side, they just have these corporations sitting on top and manipulating with the government anyways. We really didn't see any mechanism from their side how they will actually institute any larger reform. China will ultimately hurt you if you are their enemy, but if you aren't, you stand to gain. So let's move on to the third point, the long term. Note that Team Opposition didn't actually respond to this basically at all. The US is too volatile. Every 4 years, they just decide to completely switch directions because of partisan politics and the fact that, Biden in his first few days decided to make like executive orders to reverse everything that Trump had done. Also, the IMF is Western-centric, and this alternative that they would propose would ultimately introduce austerity measures that would further sink the poor into the ground. The harm is equivalent, whether you keep someone down or you actively prevent it, whether you push them down or prevent them from rising up. Team Opposition would do both with no remorse.
Thank you for that speech. Opposition Web Parent.
So am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Yep. That's great. In that case, I will start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Dear panel, note how the proposition never understands the fact that where China gets this power to have human rights violations, to do all these bad things to all these countries, is the fact that it has a lot of money to do so. We tell you that we want to decrease the amount of money China has to do bad things instead of increasing it, which the propositions want. Now, note that this is just not a debate where we talk about, oh yeah, more trade is good trade. We tell you that we also have to talk about all the people who are going to suffer through these geopolitics issues. We are going to tell you that dead people do not care about GDP growth, nor do they care about what kind of job they have. So in this speech, I'm going to talk about 3 main agents in this debate. First of all, I'm going to talk about ASEAN, then I'm going to talk about China. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the entirety of the world. So let's talk about ASEAN and then about the poor in ASEAN. So right now, we tell you that ASEAN enjoys quite a bit of autonomy, but we tell you that this is going to change with more Chinese investments. We have told you how debt traps happen everywhere, including in Asia. For example, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. We have told you how China keeps Duterte in power with its own money, no thank you, with its own money, where it has a regime where they constantly kill people under the guise of a war on drugs, even people who are completely innocent with no remorse whatsoever. We tell you that this is also more likely to happen to these ASEAN countries now, because more and more of their trades depends on China, so they're more likely to try to self-censor, try to be in China's good graces. We have told you about this in all of our previous speeches. They have not responded to it. Tell you that ASEAN is actually quite a diverse place. Yes, they have 50-something million poor, but we tell you that they also have Singapore, they also have rich, no thank you. So we tell you that the best agent to solve ASEAN's problems is ASEAN itself. They are the only ones who know exactly what is going on there, exactly what needs changing. And we think that the more autonomy they have to solve their own problems, the better they are going to do that. Because we in the West might think, yeah, these people, they need free clothes and they need free food, but they actually need maybe something entirely different, while we just crown out local entrepreneurship. So tell you that it's not, our point in this debate is not that how we're going to reform every country on earth. Our point in this debate is that how do we keep China from making more countries authoritarian? How do we stop this vicious cycle we're in? And this is something the proposition never deals with. But not right now. Let's talk about the poor in ASEAN. As I've already told you about the Philippines, let's also talk specifics, since the proposition really likes specifics. Let's talk about how in Malaysia, China develops some areas so the richer keeps others poorer in order to initiate tensions between the people. I tell you that this is so that these countries have to work more on defense and get the money that the proposition likes to talk about anyway. We tell you this is so the countries cannot focus on what's really important, the fact that China is funding terrorists basically sometimes and doing really bad things, and instead what is happening at the moment. We tell you that China has no motivation whatsoever to build up ASEAN countries. Why is that? The proposition tells us that they want labor. What they want is cheap labor. If you have a growing middle class, of course they're going to want more and more money. So there's no point in giving them any more education or giving them any better living standards, because that will just end up in them wanting higher wages. And so that point has immediately fallen from the proposition side, because China is never going to willingly give them higher wages if they can keep giving them cheaper ones. That is why all of those people in ASEAN already suffer. Before I go on, I would take a POI.
Given that you've just told us the West can't know what ASEAN needs, how would the West know how to help them?
We think the West helps them with the fact that they do actual trade. The West helps with the fact that it isn't actively undermining their politics. The West helps with the fact that they're not actively trying to create ethnic tensions in areas. We tell you that this is how the West helps. We tell you that ASEAN, the more they can do what they want the best themselves. But let's talk about China. The proposition really loves telling us that, China is so big, so wonderful, they do good things. We tell you that the more money you give to China, the more power you give to China. The more power you give to China, the more power it has to, for example, put concentration camps in Xinjiang. The more money it has to fund the Philippines, the more money it has to build infrastructure in countries with loans the countries are never going to pay back, only to get that piece of land under their control later. We tell you that this matters a lot. Why does it matter? Because in this situation, it's not just ASEAN who is suffering now. This is every single person on earth who now has more potential to suffer because of this. We tell you that China is not completely unstoppable right now, but if we give them more money to do whatever they want, they soon will be. No, thank you. And this is the world the proposition is trying to give us. They're going to say, oh, China is going to do all these good things. We tell you, no, they're not. If there's oil in the South China Sea, why would they ever give other countries the ability to go there and pay for that oil if they can just, get it out of the ground themselves and then get it for free. We tell you that China is never going to make lives better for them because it's in its interest to make countries dependent. Why dependent and not just trade partners? Because dependence makes it so no thank you that they can never ever go away. China thinks in the long term. In the short term, sure, you might have some development, but in the long term, it's only to have more countries that can never leave, because Xi Jinping is probably never going to leave from this place, and they want to keep as much money for themselves for as long as possible. We tell you that the situation in North Korea, in the Philippines, everywhere will be so much worse if we have more Chinese power. The proposition never tells us how they are going to make these things for happening. They just tell us, oh yeah, but like China has a lot of money, that's cool. We get to improve the lives in the people of ASEAN. We have proven to you in all of our arguments how that is not the case. We have told you how China likes to create dependence. We have told you how it's never going to appear positive things. I have told you how they're not going to get higher wages. Like really, China has a large history being very negligent in regards to workers and labor regulations. The proposition has to defend a world where people are going to suffer more and more just because they want a slice of the China pie. But let's talk about the rest of the world in general. They tell us that the US is too volatile to ever really do anything. We tell you that trade doesn't change that much between presidential terms. Sure, political things may, but if you really want to buy those potatoes, you're going to buy them regardless of whether Biden is in power or Trump. We tell you that this is also very largely like mitigated by the fact that the West is multiple countries with their own agendas, who want to do their own things, who want to consume different products. We tell you that this is never going to be the case with China, who produces largely the same thing that ASEAN does. We tell you that ASEAN is going to suffer all the environmental impacts, all the other impacts from dealing with China. We have told you this in our two arguments. We gave you multiple mechanisms. They never replied to any single one. They just said, well, China good. We tell you that is not how the world works. For all of those reasons, vote opposition.
Thank you for that speech. We would like to invite opposition reply to close their case.
Hello, I hope you can still hear me. This is probably louder, so this is probably better, hopefully. Right, and I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Dear panel, this debate wasn't about Asian. This debate was about China and how much control we give to China. This debate obviously is worded as this house believes, not this house as Asian, right? Therefore, we think that proposition has made a very strategic mistake and hasn't really engaged with our case at all on any significant level, right? In my speech, I will firstly explain why China is so harmful and who reduces China's harms the best, as we've done through all of our speeches. Right. We think that proposition has agreed from their first speech, from the first POI I made them about, do they think that China's like genocide and other harmful things are bad? They said that they're very, very harmful and they don't want this to happen more, right? These are the examples of like China hurting every country in the world, basically, like through the mechanism we gave in our first speech on how they make them dependent. This is like North Korea, where they have a political dictator that has very much killed people and does keep killing people, and also threatens like South Korea, who cannot be safe and sound. People maybe cannot sleep there at night because they're afraid North Korea might have a nuclear bomb that they might detonate and kill everyone there, right? Secondly, we think that there are Uyghur people, right, the Muslims that are in concentration camps that are actively being killed. We think that being killed is much, much worse than being like poor, since you can't do really anything when you're dead, whereas when you're poor, you still have like some possibility to improve your situation. And thirdly, we think that they take control from countries that are like economically well off, right? This is like having control of Singapore, Sri Lanka's port, right? Where they can just turn trade on and off by their liking through these debt traps, right? We think that everyone understands that this is much, much more harmful for the entirety of the human population all around the world, not only for Asian, right? Therefore, this is the harm that really counts, not only the harms that Asian might possibly face. So we think that the team that proved that who reduces China's power the most wins this debate, as China is this bad of an actor. We think that the proposition did not really prove how they're going to make China less powerful and therefore less capable of doing these horrible, horrible, horrible things that threaten the lives of millions, if not billions of people, right? We think the proposition is just giving them more money, not letting West become dependent, not dependent on China, and possibly harming these Asian countries even further with no control of their actions, right? This is the most harmful thing you could possibly do. Give the dictator who's killing people more money, right? Under us, we have proven to you how this might be reduced in our case, right? We think that Asian is the alternative to China that the West currently has. They export the same things. We think that the quantities can be like made bigger if this is what the West really needs. We've shown you how this is this is the mechanism how China controls the West right now, through having this control over their economies and also like over their like politicians through this, and also through the electorate who when the politician does not want to lose the election because it has hurt their economy, right? Reducing this trade is the only way we're ever going to get rid of Xi Jinping, ever going to control Xi Jinping, I should say. This is the only thing that Xi Jinping cares about. And this is the analysis which the third speaker, who had 8 minutes, did not engage with on any level, right? This is why we have won this debate. We have people who we can take control away from, people who are actively harming other people in this world. And this is the only mechanism in this debate how we can do this. And they've never really engaged on any significant level with that. We think that since this debate is about the entire world, not only Asian, and this debate has been about China's power, and we reduced China's power the best, you have to vote opposition.
Thank you for that speech. We would like to invite Proposition Reply to close their case. Here.
I hope you hear me. I'll start in just a second. In one of their speeches, opposition asked a rhetorical question. How do we know that ASEAN wants its poorest, like that the poorest individuals of ASEAN want like food and clothes? Maybe it's something else. And then they never answered the question. Well, let's answer it now. Yes, it's exactly food and clothes that the poorest individuals in ASEAN want. They want to urbanize. They do not want to live on the edge of starvation. In many of these instances, we think we help the most vulnerable actor in this debate. So we have to adjudicate this motion by two most important questions. First, on which side of the house we provide larger economic growth and therefore uplift most people out of poverty in ASEAN. And secondly, which side of the house is smarter geopolitically, right? Now, let's go on to the first clash in this debate. The first and probably one of the main things that we talked about was about infrastructure, right? We told that all the investments that come in from China are actually like beneficial to boosting like the long-term GDP of those countries and like helping the poor directly because they stay behind. The only response that we got so far is like China blowing them up when they leave, like in some sort of a Die Hard movie with like all the dynamite they got. We already refuted this idea and they never responded to that. However, they lack comparative. Compare that to all of the United States companies, and even if they like trade with ASEAN countries at the moment, they can like transfer profits from like these countries back to the West with a single click in an internet bank, right? China can't do that because the ports and the roads and the railways stay there, right? The dams that they have built on the Mekong River help provide millions of people with electricity and boost long-term economic growth. Then we talked about the different incentives that exist both on China's side and in other like financial organizations, right? They wanted to talk about the liquidity traps, but we expected this. We already preemptively told you that there are like ASEAN is a collective entity with more bargaining power. You have things like Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which wants to see like ASEAN and Asia dominate as like a trade hub in the whole world, right? They simply told us that because something happened in Africa, the same will happen in ASEAN. Note that this is a logical fallacy that we pointed out in our second and third speeches, that they had like 30 minutes probably to respond to, but they never did. Now, also, we talked about things like the map, that basically the Pacific is a lot larger than like the South China Sea. Of course, the Mercator projection or whatever could distort this slightly, but like there's common sense that they're just like closer to trade with China. Then we talked about the most vulnerable being able to urbanize because China needs cheap labor. Yes, the labor is cheap, right? But the comparative, again, in this motion is them living on the edge of starvation and just like depending on harvest, on each like consecutive harvest, right? Because we have shown you that we definitely help the poorest individuals in ASEAN, we already take this debate. But now, on to the second flashpoint about geopolitics, right? Their main claim here is like basically their whole case just like channels down to this. Oh, China will have less money, therefore they will be less able to exploit people all around the world. Well, the world that they live in is the status quo, where the West is already the main trade partner, as they already pointed out in their first speech. We asked this in a PO, why has nothing changed, right? Why are Uyghurs still imprisoned? We got absolutely no response. It is not clear to us how through their mechanisms are they able to like depose Xi Jinping, even though there are already tariffs in place. And even if China has like gradually like 5% less money, like what? Are they going to take the like air conditioning away from the like Uyghur like labor camps? No, they still keep them in prison and nothing changes in the mindset of the Chinese Communist Party. We recognize that China is not perfect, but we as proposition say C for China proudly.